It was the end of my first semester in college. I decided that I was going to go with the rest of my family and spend time with my grandparents and celebrate Christmas. It was just one of those fantastic family moments filled with wonderful, awesome memories. And yet the thing that I remember most from that trip is not awesome at all. It was incredibly awkward. It was incredibly embarrassing for me. Have you ever had one of those moments? Have you ever had an experience where you're so embarrassed and it feels so awkward that those emotions stay with you for years? What I'm about to share with you happened over 20 years ago, and I can still feel what I felt in that moment. It was Christmas morning. I was hanging out with my grandmother. The phone rang, and it was my aunt who called, my great aunt, and she told me that she wanted me to come to her house because she had been holding on to a high school graduation gift for me, and she wanted me to have it. I was a little bit surprised by that because this is a family member who I hadn't really talked to in years. You know how everybody, at least I think everybody, I do, have those members of the family, the side of the family who you don't really know that well? Well, that's what this was for me, but I didn't want to be unkind, and I was grateful, so I decided to jump in the truck and drive over to her house. And I knocked on the door, and I heard someone say, "Come in," so I walked in, and what I saw when I got there is the kind of thing that you would expect on Christmas morning. There were all kinds of people messing about with the Christmas gifts that they had just opened, and the house was full, and everybody is doing their own thing. And there I am, I'm standing in the living room, and no one talked to me. And I was just standing there awkwardly, and eventually I just said, so Aunt Luttrell invited me over, and then I could see her in the next room, and she said, "Oh, hi, Rick." And then she went back to doing her thing. You want to know what happened next? Nothing. Nothing happened. I just stood there in the living room and no one talked to me. My aunt, who had invited me over, never said another word to me after that brief exchange, and no one gave me a present. I was just standing there, embarrassed, feeling awkward in the silence of my own thoughts. And eventually I just decided I don't think I could take this anymore. And so I decided I'm going to leave. And I just said out loud, "I think I'm going to go now." And someone said, "Thanks for coming over." And I walked out, just embarrassed and feeling incredibly awkward. And even though I was invited over, I felt like I was intruding, and I felt like an outsider. I felt like I didn't belong. And I still can't explain to you why that happened that day, but it was embarrassing 20 years ago. And I still feel the way that I felt in that moment when I think about it, when I talk about it. And that moment, clearly, I haven't forgotten. And it was a pivot moment for me. That moment, that experience, it shaped the way that I think, and it still impacts the way that I think. Because I never want to do anything that causes somebody to feel the way that I felt in that moment. And I certainly don't ever want to do anything, and I don't want to be a part of a church, and I don't want to pastor a church that would ever intentionally do something or unintentionally do something to cause people to feel that way whenever they visit our church. And if you've ever been made to feel like an outsider, if you know what it's like to be treated like you don't belong, then you can get the punch. You get the punch of this question that I want us to consider. It's this right here. What's the difference between an experience with Christianity from an experience with Christians? That's a complex and perhaps nuanced question, and maybe a lot of fun and frothy to talk about. But here's the deal, and you know this, don't you? That people investigate Jesus and they consider Jesus and they evaluate Jesus through the filter of their experiences with you and with me. People evaluate Jesus through the filter of their experience with Jesus followers. That means people in our community will evaluate Jesus through the filter of their experiences with Autumn Ridge Church. What do you want that experience to be like? Imagine if we are their first experience or their latest experience. What do you want that experience to be like? We want to be like Jesus. And we want what people experience with us to help them see what it's like to know Jesus for themselves. It's just one of the small reasons. It's just part of why it's so important for us to focus on our church culture. We want to be like Jesus, and when people experience us, we want that to be helpful for them to experience and understand what it'd be like to know Jesus for themselves. Last week I introduced this. Do you remember this? Values, time, behavior, that equals culture. And we want to be the kind of church where Jesus' values are our values, where Jesus' commands, those become our behavior. And when you combine those things, our church culture here at Autumn Ridge, it will be a gospel culture. Our church culture will be a church culture that is like Jesus. And no church ever drifts into healthy culture. No church accidentally drifts into a Jesus-honoring culture. It comes because of decisions. It comes because people were intentional, because we align our values with his values, because we align our behavior with his commands, and then our culture begins to look like Jesus. And so our church has adopted, our pastors, our elders, and we have adopted 8 core values. And for the rest of this series, each week we're looking at 2 different values. Last week we talked about the values of truth and grace. And today we're going to talk about 2 more values. Here they are. Number 1, honor guests enthusiastically. We care more about your experience than our own. Here's our second value. Belong before you believe. You don't have to think like we think or act like we act to be accepted here. Each week as we begin our conversation and talking about our mission and our vision and our values, we start at the same place. We're going to our base camp, and that's 2 Corinthians chapter 5. And this is written by one of the most influential people in all of human history. We're talking about the Apostle Paul. And when he first wrote these words, since he first wrote these words, they have been taken to heart by billions of people. We want to take these words to heart. We take his words to heart. This is what he said: "For Christ's love compels us." We're compelled by his love because we are convinced that one died for all, and therefore all died. And he died for all, that those who live should no longer live for themselves. We don't live for ourselves. If we've trusted in Christ, we live for him. We live for what he lives for. We no longer live for ourselves, but for him who died for them and was raised again. If you and I are compelled by the love of Christ, then we want to live for him. And that is a good thing. And what that means is to bend all of ourselves to be in alignment with his commands and with his values. And you know, that's a good thing. Many of us, we have discovered the joy. There is limitless joy in that kind of life. And yet, choosing to live for him will put us on a collision course with ourselves. Choosing to live for him will put us on a collision course with our own preferences and with our own comforts. Are you ready for that collision? Now, today I want to share with you an encounter when a massive group of people collided with Jesus. This is what happens. We're going to read about it in John chapter 2. When it was almost the time for the Jewish Passover, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple courts, he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and others sitting at tables exchanging money. And so he made a whip out of cords. Imagine that. Imagine watching Jesus just making a whip, getting ready to go at people. So he made a whip out of cords, and he drove all of them from the temple courts, both sheep and cattle. And he scattered the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. And to those who sold doves, he said, "Get these out of here. Stop turning my Father's house into a market." Before we go any further, before we dive deeper into this, I want us to notice something, and it's this right here. Jesus was outraged, but he wasn't out of control. He was outraged, but not out of control. This was not an instantaneous freak out moment by Jesus. He didn't respond emotionally like the way you or I would respond emotionally if we walked into our house to discover the dog had decided to use the sofa like a chew toy. That's not what's going on. Jesus was outraged, but he was not out of control. He was under control. He was thoughtful. He was intentional. And he was calculated. He paused long enough to sit down, to take some cords and to braid them together, to make a whip. And then he handled some business. And the question is, why was he so angry? Before I can answer that question, I want to show you something. This is a picture of a mock-up of what the temple would have looked like that day when Jesus walked to the temple. And what I want you to first notice are these large kind of expansive courtyard areas. And these are the areas where all the merchants had set up shop, where they're exchanging money, where they're selling animals. It's basically this giant religious farmer's market. And what was going on is Passover. And that's an incredibly important time of the year for Jewish people. And people from all over the known world, Jews from all over the known world, traveled to Jerusalem. And what they did was they made sacrifices for their sin. The majority of people, the ones who could own it, who could afford it, they would pay to have a lamb sacrificed as a way to cover their sin. And it was also a way to commemorate how God had freed or rescued the people of Israel from the bondage of slavery in Egypt. This is a huge deal to Jewish people. For them, I mean, it would be like for us, 4th of July, Christmas, and Super Bowl all rolled into one and celebrated over the course of a week. Thousands and thousands of people would descend on the city. And because we live in Rochester, we kind of understand what that's like. This is a city of 115,000 over the course of a year. About 3 million people descend on the city. When so many people are descending on where you live, that is an opportunity to make money. And so people use this as an opportunity to make money. And when you have just thousands and thousands of people traveling into the city to make a sacrifice, you can imagine that it is unworkable to travel long distances carrying along animals for the purpose of sacrifice. You can't do that. And for the sake of convenience, people in Jerusalem decided, let's sell animals to people who are traveling here, and that way it's easier for them. It was convenient, and I'm sure that was appreciated by the people who were traveling to the temple, who were traveling to Jerusalem. Now, you can also imagine that people are coming from all over the known world, from all kinds of different countries, and when you come from different countries, you bring different currency. But only one type of currency was accepted at the temple. It was the Tyrian silver coin. But that's not really a problem. Just like when you and I travel internationally, we can exchange our currency for the currency of wherever we're at. You could do the same thing at the temple. People set up booths to exchange currency, and that always comes with a fee. Now, let's get real. Some of the guys there were shady. They were incredibly unethical. Some of the guys charged upwards of 12.5% simply to exchange money. And still, let's be honest, let's get real about this. That was a source of convenience for folks. They had set up, let's look back at this, they had set up this entire area to make it as convenient as possible for Jewish people who were traveling from faraway lands, from long distances, so that they could engage and worship. It was convenient for the merchants because they were able to make money. It was convenient for the travelers because it was just easier for them to engage and worship at the temple. So why was Jesus all bent out of shape? Why was Jesus so upset about all of this? What's wrong with that? Well, it's not because of the exchange rate, even though the exchange rate is pretty unethical. It's not because of price gouging, and it's not simply because of selling animals at or near the temple. The real reason and the real problem is far more serious, far more heartbreaking than that alone. Look again at this picture. You see these large, expansive areas? These areas at the temple, they had a name. And the name for this area told you the purpose of this area. This area was called the Court of the Gentiles, or the Gentile Court. And this was space, the largest space in the temple. Look at this. The largest space in the temple was set aside for Gentile people, people who are not Jewish, to come and worship, to come and pray, and to come and have access to the God who loves them too. And this is the kind of space that God described to the prophet Israel. In Isaiah, it says this, "And foreigners who bind themselves to the Lord, to minister to him, to love the name of the Lord, and to be his servants, all who keep the Sabbath without desecrating it, and who hold fast to my covenant, These I will bring to my holy mountain and give them joy in my house of prayer. God is saying those who trust in me, those who follow me, even if they're not Jewish, I want to bring them to my house. I want them to have joy with me. I want them to have access to me. He says their burnt offerings and sacrifices will be accepted on my altar. I accept them too. For my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations. The sovereign Lord declares. And it's interesting that he says the sovereign Lord, because this is his declaration. I'm the authority. I have the right to do whatever I want. And what I want is for my house, for my place of worship, to be a place of worship where all kinds of people from all places are drawn in. I, the sovereign Lord, declare, he who gathers the exiles of Israel, I will gather still others to them besides those already gathered. And what God is saying is, it's not just important to me that Jewish people come. It's not just important to me that Jewish people plus all the Jewish people scattered around the world come. It's important to me that all peoples from all nations come. God's heart beats for people. You cannot overestimate the intensity of God's desire to draw all peoples to himself. And the people of Israel, the Jewish people, they had a special relationship with God, but it's not because they had earned something special. They had a special relationship with God because God had a special purpose for them, a sacred purpose for them. And it was incredibly important, incredibly valuable. Their job was to be an ambassador to all the world. And part of their job was entrusted, it was a sacred trust to protect a space for Gentiles, for people who were not Jewish to come and to worship and pray and have access to the God who loves them too, to protect a space for people who were far from God, to protect a space for people who were moving towards God, to protect the space for the people who wanted to trust and follow God. It was their job to protect that, and the problem was their heart was not tuned into that. Their heart was not tuned into the people who were distant from God. Their heart was not tuned into the needs of those who were trying to move towards God. The merchants, they didn't care. The Jewish people at large, they didn't care. The temple and religious leaders, they didn't care. It's this right here. They sacrificed the needs of the people who weren't like them in order to serve the convenience of the people who were like them. We could get real honest about what their attitudes really were back then. It was this. It was, having to deal with Gentiles and having to make a space for them too and having to accommodate them. It's annoying, and I don't want to. Their attitude was essentially this: the temple is for us, and I really only care about what's in it for me. R.C. Sproul was the theologian who wrote about this encounter. He writes this: the Jews hoped that the Messiah would cleanse the temple of Gentiles, but Jesus cleansed the temple for Gentiles. The reality is that the Jewish people, the merchants, the priests, the guys who should have known better, they were burdened by the presence of guests. And they said, let's just take over their space and use this for us. Before the arrival of Jesus, before Jesus came on the scene, access to God was a place. It was the temple. But in Christ, since the arrival of Jesus, part of the good news of the gospel is that access to God is not a place, it's a person. It's the person of Jesus Christ. And if we are compelled by his love, if we live for what he lives for, if we're aligned with him, you know what that means? That means we are not burdened by the presence of guests. We're burdened if there are no guests. It's a burden to us if there aren't people here who are evaluating and considering and wondering and wanting to move closer to him. Part of being in tune with his heart and part of being aligned with him and part of being compelled by his love means that, we are going to honor guests enthusiastically and we're going to care about their experiences more than we care about our own. And knowing that access to God is not a place but a person, this is part of what this means to us, is we're going to get rid of anything that gets in the way of people's movement towards Jesus. Get rid of anything that gets in the way of people's movement towards Jesus. Now, some of you, maybe you cringe when you hear me say that. And if you cringe when you hear me say that, because for you, you're wondering, is that code language? Are those code words for that we're going to dial down truth around here? You got to hear, no, that is not the case, and that will never be the case. Please go back and watch last week's message when we talk about take truth seriously and give grace relentlessly. Trying to suppress truth doesn't make it easier for people to move towards Jesus. It makes it harder for people to move towards Jesus. Truth isn't what gets in the way of people's movement towards Jesus. It's not the presence of truth that gets in the way. It's the absence of love and grace and humility and hospitality. Those are the things that get in the way of people trying to move towards Jesus. During the Passover, during this event in which Jesus goes in and handles business and kicks people out of the temple, the overarching symbol, the ubiquitous, the dominant imagery of that day was that of sacrifice. The first century Jewish historian Josephus, he tells us that it's approximately 255,600 lambs would have been sacrificed over the week of Passover. 255,600 lambs sacrificed over the week of Passover. And if you are an animal lover and that bothers you to imagine that, or if you're the kind of person and you hear that and you're just kind of gentle in spirit and to think about 255,600 precious little gentle lambs being sacrificed, if that causes your heart to sink, that is the appropriate response. Seeing that unfold, which should stop people in their tracks. It was intended to simultaneously ignite grief over sin and hope for forgiveness. That 255,600 times, every time a little lamb's life was snuffed out, 255,600 times the message was repeated. Your sin is so serious and my sin is so significant that the only response is death, and the only hope is that a sacrifice was made on our behalf. And if you're a follower of Jesus, you celebrate that. You celebrate that a sacrifice was made for our sin. If you're not yet a follower of Jesus, or you wouldn't consider yourself a church person, if you're still trying to kick the tires on the gospel and whether or not you trust this, maybe you cringe. Maybe on first blush, maybe you feel a little bit offended by that. That just sounds wrong. Would it be okay if I asked, is it really though? Is it really offensive? Think about this with me. How many of you have watched your friend's life fall apart because of morally broken choices that they made or somebody else made? How many of you have experienced something good in your life? It was either killed or just wrecked because of your own morally broken choices or the morally broken choices of someone else. I mean, isn't it true that we really don't have to look that far to build an overwhelming case that our morally broken choices will break just about everything in our lives? And though it was devastating to watch, every time a lamb was sacrificed, it communicated this, that your sin and my sin, it kills us. And yet, there is hope. And this is the good news of the gospel message, is that Jesus is the final and the ultimate sacrifice for sin. And for all those years that Jews participated in sacrificing a lamb, it was in hopes that one day there would be a final sacrifice. And Jesus said, I am that sacrifice. And if you trust in me, I will never hold your sin against you ever again. And that is the message that we carry. That's the message that we get to be ambassadors of. That's the message that we get to share. That's the message that we get to share with other people. And that is incredibly good news. And it's not the presence of truth that will ever get in the way of that message. It's the absence of love and grace and humility and hospitality in the folks who carry the message. That's the only thing that would ever get in the way of people's movement towards Jesus. If you're a history buff, if you're keen on history, you know what this weekend is. It's Reformation weekend. This Sunday is Reformation Sunday. And the key figures of the Reformation, men like John Calvin and Martin Luther and John Huss and William Tyndale and others, these were men who were grieved. Their hearts were broken for all the excesses and religious rules and exploitation that got in the way of people getting to know Jesus for themselves. And so these men dedicated their lives, and at great cost, some of them even lost their lives in order to paving the way so that people could know Jesus for themselves. They're men who lived for this. Let's get rid of anything that gets in the way of people's movement towards Jesus. One of the things that Martin Luther did, strategically, intentionally, wrote gospel truth to music. And we know them as hymns. We know them as songs. And he set those songs to barroom tunes of the day because he wanted people to sing them and think about them. And if he were alive today, if the Reformation was today, he wouldn't set his songs to barroom tunes. Instead, he'd probably turn to the Billboard Hot 100. And I can't even imagine what it would be like to sing A Mighty Fortress Is Our God to the tune of a Justin Bieber song or a Drake song. But if Martin Luther was alive today, that's exactly what would have happened. And his 95 Thesis would have been posted on Facebook because he was a man who lived for this. Get rid of anything that gets in the way of people's movement towards Jesus. And if you're thinking, Rick, I think I'm with you. I think I get that. I want to do that. You might have a question. If this is your question, it's normal, it's understandable, it deserves an answer. And some people might be asking this. Well, where does belong before you believe fit into that? I can understand that the first value, the honor guests enthusiastically, but belong before you believe, that sounds like it's written for people who aren't even a part of our church yet. How does that work? Well, you're right. That's the way that it is written. And if you're not a part of our church yet, if you're still kicking the tires on Christianity, if you're considering whether or not you want to be a part of us or our church or to trust in Christ, we want you to know that you can belong before you believe. And for those of you who are part of Autumn Ridge, for that to be true and for us to be able to say that with authenticity, that means that we have to align our hearts and our approach to people to line up with Jesus's approach to people. And to show you what I'm talking about, let's turn to the very next chapter in John chapter 3. Now, there was a Pharisee, a religious leader, a man named Nicodemus, who was a member of the Jewish ruling council. That means he's a big deal. And he came to Jesus at night and said, Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher who has come from God. For no one could perform the signs that you are doing if God were not with him. And then Jesus replied, very truly, I tell you, no one can see the kingdom of God unless they are born again. And that is the kickoff of a really fascinating conversation. I would encourage you to go read the rest of it in John chapter 3. It's in that conversation that probably the most famous verse in all the Bible is given. John 3:16, that God loved the world so much he gave his one and only son that whoever believes in him will not perish but have everlasting life. But this is what I want us to do. I want us to make some observations about this encounter that they had together. And one of the first questions I want us to engage is this: why did Nicodemus come at night? Well, the reason that he came to Jesus at night was because he was curious about Jesus. He wanted to know more about Jesus, but he wasn't ready to risk anybody seeing him with Jesus. Nicodemus came at night because he had questions that he wanted to answer, and he wanted to probe Jesus more, and he wanted to get more information, but he was not ready to risk his reputation. He was not ready to risk people knowing, and he certainly wasn't ready to risk his way of life or his lifestyle. Do you think Jesus was offended by that? Well, the answer is no, he wasn't at all. Jesus' attitude, Jesus' response was essentially this: hey, listen, if you want to come at night and you want to keep this on the low and you don't want anybody to know about it, even if that means I got to rearrange my schedule and have a night meeting with you, I will do that. That is just the way Jesus was with people. That's what Jesus is like. And I want you to remember that Nicodemus was a Pharisee. He was a member of the ruling class. His best friends, the guys that he ran with, his crew, these were the guys who wanted to kill Jesus and ultimately pulled it off and killed Jesus. And Jesus' attitude was essentially this: even though the closest people in your life, the people who you care about most right now, are the people who want to kill me, I still want to be with you. It's so important to me that I took on humanity. I took on what it meant to be human so that I could be with you and so that you could know what it's like to know me and so that you could know that I want you. And it's totally okay. Even if you're not sure where you stand with me, even if you don't believe in me yet, I want you to know that you belong with me. And when we talk about belong before you believe, we're not talking about church membership. We're not talking about anything like that. What we're talking about as a church is that we want to be like Jesus. And we want to be the kind of people that communicate to everyone that we love you and we welcome you and you're accepted here. And that even if you never decide, even if you were never to decide that you want to trust and follow Jesus, we are never going to change our minds that we value you, that we want you here, and we think that you belong with us. I want you to think about it this way. What it looks like to consider Jesus, that's up to you. Have you recognized this before? That Jesus was so gentle and Jesus was so humble that many times he let other people set the terms on what the encounter with him was going to be like. And yet, to become a follower of Jesus is different. There has to be a transition of authority from us to him. What it looks like to consider Jesus, that's up to you. What it looks like to follow Jesus, that's up to him. Following Jesus is not like a choose-your-own-adventure novel that many of us probably read as kids. We don't get to dictate the story. He becomes the leader. He's the boss. He becomes the ultimate authority, and we trust and we follow him. And if you're trying to figure out what you think about Jesus and whether or not you trust the gospel, if you've got questions, if you're still investigating and evaluating, that's okay. What it looks like to consider Jesus, that's up to you. You get to take all the time that you need. And what it looks like to follow Jesus, that's up to him. In just a few minutes, I'm going to share with you what might be my favorite story to date here at Autumn Ridge Church, and it's a story of what happened of someone who was considering Jesus and ultimately chose to become a follower of Jesus, and it happened long before I ever got here. But before I share with you that story, I want to share this. Every battleground has winners and losers, except for soccer. For some reason, they're okay with ties. But let's go back. Every battleground has winners and losers. And every heart is a battleground. Who are the winners and losers on the battleground of your heart? Who are the winners and losers on the battleground of your kid's heart, of your spouse's heart, of your friend's heart? Who are the winners and losers on the battleground of the hearts for our nation, for our community? I bet the people who are the winners in the battleground of your heart are very similar to the kinds of people who are the winners on the battleground of my heart. Let me tell you first what they're not. They're not necessarily the people who are merely truth tellers. And they're not merely the people who we agree with. Because isn't it true, let's get honest with ourselves, isn't it true that there are many people who we stand with, but we can't stand being around? It's not simply the people who we agree with. It's not merely the people who are truth tellers. It's the people who win the battleground of our hearts, the people who win your trust, the people who win my trust. They are the people who leave no doubt that they love us, that they accept us, and they want the best for us. And they love us and they accept us, not because of what we think or what we do. They simply love us and accept us because we are. And these are the kind of people. These are the kind of people that we turn to and we trust to tell us the truth, even when we don't want to hear the truth. I want you to check out this story.
I've known Norm for years. He's a truly great guy. Of course, he's English. He used to play cricket and rugby, so you know that he's part of the elect. And we invited him to our man group that meet here every Wednesday evening. There's 13 of us back in to study the scriptures. And I was so pleased when Norman said he'd come along.
The Bible study from John Steer, I think, was rather a very good piece of timing by him. He'd set up this group, the man group, and he invited me to come along. And John's sometimes a difficult person to say no to, but he was kind of pushing on an open door.
Well, every single person's made in the image of God, and they're therefore very precious to God. And this group is not just for Christians. This is for anybody who is interested in knowing what the Bible says. And you can come along with questions. All of us have to lead it and take turns doing that. But it's okay to say, I don't buy into this at this point. And you're accepted wanted. You are beloved, and certainly Norm, as the others, are part of that. We're all valuable, and whether or not we come to faith or not, you can still be part of a group.
England's a very secular society, and it's not normal to be a Christian, it's unusual to be a Christian, and it's very easy to fall away, and I did. Oh, they were very aware that I didn't follow Jesus, and I think there were 2 of us at the time, but they were very welcoming, they were accepting, they were interesting people who I respected, and it became a very easy group to go to, not just because of the Christian content, but because these were people I wanted to be with.
I think it's very important to be patient and let God do his work. It's not my job or anybody else's job, it's the Holy Spirit's job. And so we hang on and we care for people. We don't stop caring for people just because they don't agree with us. We continue to love them. And so it might be 5 years, it might be 10. I've got friends I've known for 50 years that I'm still interested in. I still pray for them, but we're allowing God to do his work.
John had organised a mass baptism event at Alton Ridge. I used to call it being dunked, and I'd say to my wife, "Oh, I'm never going to be dunked." I wrestled with whether I should go up or not. And I looked at my wife, and I looked at the audience, and I thought, gosh, I really don't want to do this. And I did. And I felt this overwhelming sense of God's pleasure. And it was one of the most amazing feelings I've ever had. There's no doubt that the men in the man group were instrumental in helping me. And I think they did it primarily through their example. They're men I admired and respected. They were intelligent men, and some of them still are. But most of them believed absolutely in God. You know, they just chipped away at me. And I'm really glad to have this opportunity to thank them, because the last time I did this, I totally forgot. I've now been at Alton Ridge for 10 years, I guess. From my experience, my N of 1, it's absolutely a place where you can belong without believing, where you can ask questions without being scared, without feeling small, or without feeling stupid. It's a great place to be if you want to belong before you believe.
I love that story. And it's a story like that, and it's a legacy like that here in this church. It's just one of the reasons that I fell in love with Alton Ridge. Let me turn us back to what the Apostle Paul said. For Christ's love compels us. This is what it means to be compelled. This is our series thesis. When what you have to do is what you want to do, it feels like what you get to do. This is what we have to do. And because his love compels us, it is what we want to do. And oh my goodness, what a privilege, what a gift it is. This is what we get to do. We get to honor guests enthusiastically. And we get to be the kind of church where we can say with authenticity from the depths of our heart, this is a place where you can belong before you believe.